Okay, let's talk about mistakes. I've even got a fresh cigar to make sure I'm on point here. So what I like to do is talk about mistakes themselves, talk about a couple of scenarios that I think are good food for thought, and then also I've put together an informal top 10 list of why I think referees most often make mistakes, to really try to fully cover the subject. So when I say mistakes, though, I want to be clear. I'm talking about genuine misapplications of the written rules that have an impact on the match. I'm not talking about philosophical or interpretive mistakes or referees' decisions, things in the gray area of discussion where we could actually argue for both sides of a given call and have a logical discussion about whether it's correct or not. I'm talking about bona fide mistakes. I'm also going to talk about, in terms of skill levels of referees and the mistakes that they make. I'm going to talk about an average day. I'm not going to talk about a bad day at work for anybody. The kind of day where you're just off your game and you're not yourself and you're not your normal skill level. So we're talking about an average day for these different skill levels of bad, average, and great referees. So the way I break down mistakes is in the three categories: frequency, severity, and correction. So frequency is literally how often a given referee makes mistakes. And the difference between a bad referee and a great referee can be quite a wide chasm. A bad referee can make many mistakes per match. They may make the same type of mistake over and over and over again every time they see it. Additionally, a bad referee may even be told what his mistake is and to correct it, and he's not able to make an adjustment where he does not consistently make the same mistake over and over again in the course of the day. An average referee may make many mistakes during the course of the entire day. They may also have issues with consistency, where they're making the same type of mistake over and over and over again. But I think that an average referee has a higher capability of recognizing the mistake and perhaps correcting it in the future. A great referee may only make a few mistakes for the day. Maybe one mistake. Maybe no mistakes for the day at all. It's possible. A great referee will have the ability to even recognize the few mistakes that he's made and have a high percentage capability of correcting that mistake. Or, if he doesn't correct it on the spot, great referees that I've worked with, the event will literally stick out in their mind, and it's something they'll bring up later, even though that they've watched perhaps hours and hours of Jiu Jitsu or grappling. They'll literally, the one call they made will stick out in their mind as, I made this mistake. And it'll actually bother them, but they can identify it out of all the calls they made during the day. So that level of recognition of their mistake, and they'll also seek not only corrective action, but the opinions of others to try to understand better why it was a mistake, how to fix it in the future, those kinds of things. So they'll be fully engaged for the few mistakes that they may make for the day. Now, the next thing that's relevant to the skill levels and mistakes in general is severity. And severity speaks specifically to the timing and impact that a given mistake has. And let me give a scenario. So, great referee A makes one mistake during the day. He does not give an advantage that he should. But great referee A did not give the advantage during a 6-year-old kid match. And the kid that did not get his advantage is winning 20-0. And the only people watching are a couple of coaches and maybe a couple of parents. This kind of single error for the day may go unnoticed. It certainly doesn't have an impact to the match, being that the competitor that missed out on his advantage was winning by great disparity anyway. It's the kind of mistake that people may come up to the referee out of curiosity later and say, "Hey, shouldn't that have been an advantage?" And you'll be like, "Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that I did. I made a mistake there." So it won't be the kind of thing that really draws a lot of attention, or certainly had an impact in that particular match. Okay, so now great referee B. He's going to miss the same advantage, but he's going to miss the advantage during a black belt match, one that has money on the line. One that's on a pay-per-view event, one that is watched by every spectator in the place, that's being filmed so it will play online for years to come. And it's going to have an outcome or an impact on the outcome of the match, because it's that mistake is actually going to decide the winner. This kind of mistake, merely because of the timing and the impact, is a completely different scenario, obviously, than great referee A, who went largely unnoticed. And yet, the same mistake, the same one mistake for the day, can damage that referee's reputation or his credibility. It could be transposed that this was evidence of how the entire referee team was officiating for the day. It could be evidence of the symptoms of poor performance for the entire tournament as an organization, and that when people speak about how poor the refereeing was at this particular tournament, that's the example that they'll give. As you can see, by this one mistake, that could be really unfair. Really unfair, and that's part of, I think, the challenge that referees can find, and what people mean when they say, "Hey, this is a thankless job. Here you were nearly perfect, yet you're completely thrown under the bus by coaches and fans at the tournament. Maybe you're chastised by peers and the tournament organizers for blowing that call during that critical match. Maybe it's talked about on social media about how you blew it." So I hope the scenarios, or the scenario that I described, and this dichotomy of impact, illustrates really the complexity of refereeing and how unfair it can sometimes be, and how it can be largely unfair, not just for the individual referee, but to transpose that onto the greater referee team or the tournament as a whole. It could be really unfair. Now, what I'll mention also here is that it's very often that multiple skill levels coexist together at tournaments. In other words, great referees and bad referees can actually commingle within a single event. So your mileage can certainly vary from an individual or from a collective team based on that. Obviously, better run tournaments have a more consistent group of high-performing referees, or in some cases, and largely again for things like budget or location or some of the other hiring decisions that I mentioned, you can get collections of either poor or inexperienced referees in one place at one time. And these mistakes are more obvious, more frequent, and more severe. What I'd like to do also is give a top 10 reason, I think, for referees' mistakes, and maybe this will shed some additional information on exactly why referees make mistakes. The list I made, I call it a top 10, but it's not necessarily in a particular order, although I think it is categorized from most frequent to least frequent reason. So the first reason I think referees make mistake is an imperfect knowledge of the rules. And as I said in my lengthy discussion about rules themselves, there's more to refereeing than what's just in the written rules, and refs have to consistently educate themselves on the organization they work for and their rules, as well as all those gray areas and interpretations that we know about that exist out there, to make sure that they're the most capable that they can be when they're out on the mat. Number 2 is a reluctance to immediately analyze and correct mistakes. So some referees just don't have the skills to immediately analyze or use that outside input, as we talked about. When people are screaming at you, they completely shut it out and don't utilize the outside input correctly. Or even as the wheels are turning in their head, there's a fear mechanism inside, a pride mechanism inside that can prevent them from again, this self-analysis and correction that's really critical to handling mistakes. Third is pressure from outside influences. So in the course of that outside input, referees will impact with top-level competitors, legendary coaches, irate parents. All these folks will have an agenda as far as being the advocate for their competitor. And while we can assume that their motives are altruistic as far as wanting to see the correct outcome served, there's very often that savvy coaches and instructors that are coaching will use misinformation or just their reputation to exert this pressure. And you'll see situations where there'll be an inexperienced referee out there who's feeling the pressure of a particular match, and if the right coach yells out, "Hey, where's the points, ref?" the referee, just out of, again, fear or pride or pressure, will throw up the score that they think people want to hear, which isn't necessarily correct. Observing unfamiliar positions. Much like people's training, they have preferences. They have things they like to do. They have things that they're good at. You might be a guard guy. You might be a top player. You may love Barembolo. You may think 50-50 is stupid. All those preconceived notions associated with a referee's training can have an impact on how he applies the rules, just because he doesn't spend enough time either in those positions or watching them to be savvy, or he's somewhat disinterested in them. A referee may say, "I don't like competitors that play 50-50, so he's not familiar with the position, nor is he interested in paying attention and watching it correctly." So you really have to be an overall student of the game, and you can't limit your refereeing skills to really the kind of jiu-jitsu that you like, because you'll see so many diverse games out there. You really have to be a student of all of them. Number 5, lack of attention to necessary detail. I think of bad positioning and looking at things like grips very closely, and the mistakes that can be made around that. I think about scenarios where we see a referee in a far corner with his arms folded, watching from a distance. You're not going to be in a good position to correctly officiate if you think you can distance yourself from the action. You really have to get your hands dirty, so to speak, make sure that you're watching even the smallest details if you're going to have any chance of making sure that you're correctly applying the rules. And not just the scoring rules, but all the other rules associated with, fouls, penalties, and so forth. You really got to watch closely. You don't want to miss submissions. You don't want people going unconscious because you're not paying attention. So these are all things that contribute to referees' mistakes. Number 6 is fatigue. There are some organizations that have the luxury of having enough referee staff that they can rotate people in rather fresh every hour or so. Those people get a rest and a new ref staff comes in, but that's not the norm. More often than not, and I can speak from my own experience, a lot of times you work 10 to 12 hour days with hardly a break or maybe a lunch, and you're just tired. And I think of it kind of like being a long distance truck driver who's got a 12-hour ride. I mean, you may be fine for the first 6 hours, but if you're going straight, that last 6 hours you really start to drag, and by the end of it you're toast. So referees have to be able to understand the limits of their own physical abilities as well. Understand that they need a rest, they need a break, they need water, they need to eat. Or you can just guarantee that you're going to get bleary-eyed and mistakes will follow. Number 7 is distraction. I think the obvious distraction is those referees that are more interested in what's going on in their surroundings rather than what's going on literally in their ring with the match that they're watching. I think of a lot of times, referees will be working, let's say, a white belt or a blue belt match, but the black belts are fighting in the ring next to them. So you'll see, they spend a lot of time looking away actually as a spectator rather than as an official in the match that they're at. But I also think of distraction for those referees that go into events with things on their mind. Maybe they had a fight with their spouse on the way out of the house, or maybe they had a sick kid, or maybe they were sick themselves last night and they're trying to overcome that. These things can be literal distractions during the course of a day, and again, if it's a problem at the beginning of the day, it usually is something that spirals or snowballs and can contribute to greater errors as the day goes on. Number 8 is pride. I talked earlier about error correction, where sometimes, referees take the position of, hey, I'm infallible and what I say goes, and I made this call and it stands. I don't care what you say or what the correct answer is. And they become too rigid in their mindset and lose that moral compass I talked about, where the pursuit is what's the correct answer. Instead it becomes, my way or the highway. And I think a lot of times you lose your customer service abilities during those types of referees that are very prideful, where they're they'll tend to be more rude or short with people, and lose their politeness because they're sticking to their guns, or they feel that they're being challenged, or their integrity is in question. So these are things you really have to lose. You really got to set, kind of like your Jiu Jitsu in general. If you're training, you got to put your ego aside, be a student of the game, and understand that moral compass is to do what's right by the competitors. Number 9 is bias or favoritism. And I don't question that this exists. I think that over time it is a far less issue than it has been since Jiu-Jitsu has grown and people have recognized a series of bad biased events in the past where you'll hear American competitors say, oh, I lost because I couldn't get a fair shake, or teams complain that other teams that were officiating were or literally impacting matches to change the outcome of team standings. I don't think it's as big of a problem as people still use as a crutch related to losses. I still hear a lot of competitors cry that there are reasons that the referee made decisions, but I don't think they're as rampant as people believe or claim out there. And I think a lot of competitors have to start recognizing that their own shortcomings, either in their performance or in their own understanding of the rules, before they start to be so critical and point fingers and pick specifically this bias or favoritism excuse. And lastly, number 10, I talked about this at length, referees as employees, laziness. There's really no excuse for just being inattentive or being bad at your job. If referees are not taking the job seriously and they show up late, kind of run out there and do the best they can and don't take it serious enough and are just bad employees, I think it reflects poorly not only on their own performance. I think it's unfair to competitors, and honestly, you're not a good employee for the organization you work for. And I would contend that lazy referees, should be removed from tournaments in general. And once those folks have been identified as poor workers, they shouldn't be given opportunities to work, and it'll just make tournaments in general a better place. So this has been my overall take on mistakes. Again, talking about understanding mistakes, why they happen, and then breaking them down a little bit into these unfair scenarios. I hope give coaches, fans, competitors, spectators, other referees the opportunity to understand what's really included in this job of refereeing. I'm hoping to get more sympathy from this kind of understanding of information from those out there, that they understand what the job really entails and the complexities of it. And also for all those folks that say, I want to be a referee, I really want them to understand the complexities overall that are included in the role of referee, and I hope this has been helpful.